Welcome back to the Engadget stage. We're here live at CES. We hope you're all having a great convention. I'm Anita Sarkeesian, and joining me is Carolyn Pettit.
Hello.
We work at Feminist Frequency, which is a nonprofit that looks at pop culture from a feminist perspective. We do a lot of work that looks at pretty harmful representations of women in gaming, but today we wanted to talk about some trends in video games that came up in 2016 that we actually liked and thought were good.
Yeah.
So what did you notice?
Well, I mean, one thing that I noticed was a kind of deepening and a more complex approach to relationships. You know, I feel like a lot of times in games, and I think we have these experiences of interactions with other characters where it's all about how can I, as the player, just get what I want from this character.
Yeah, like women are often used as vending machines almost, where if you put in the right codes, you get like sex back or whatever.
You know, like in certain RPGs, what dialogue options you have to say to get the, you know, the sex cutscene or whatever.
Right.
And so it really doesn't encourage you to think about those other characters as people so much as like, what do I have to do to get exactly what I want from them?
Yeah.
And I think this year we saw games that really encourage you to think about the characters that you're interacting with differently. You know, one example of this is like this really beautiful game, The Last Guardian, you know, very popular right now on PlayStation 4, where you form this bond with this, you know, magnificent, like beautifully animated creature named Trico. And, you know, when you communicate with Trico, it's not like in some games you have a dog or a pet or whatever, an assistant, and you just tell it what to do, and it automatically does the thing, so that it feels like this extension of yourself rather than like a creature with a mind of its own. Trico is not really like that.
Right.
Yeah.
As people with pets know, they don't do what you want them to do.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So, you know, it can be a little frustrating as a player. You're kind of trying to get Trico to do something, and the creature is like kind of not immediately obeying you, and yet as a player I find that leads me to relate to Trico in a much more in a deeper way. I believe more in Trico as like a creature with their own feelings, their own like
and I feel like too, so I think some players would complain that like it makes the game not fun because you can't get the character to do what it wants, and there's a bit of a complicated development there in terms of like how much is too much in terms of like enjoyability while playing.
Right.
But also the animations and the engagement of Trico and being so like charming and the behaviors of Trico, like an animal that you would recognize, I think really contributes to the bond that you create between the player character and this
I mean,
sidekick,
you mentioned
basically.
you mentioned pets, and I mean, I've talked to pet owners, other pet owners who have played the game and really felt a resonance, something that resonates with their love of their pets,
totally.
in that connection with Trico. So I think they really did something right in handling that relationship.
Yeah. So another example that came up around this is this small indie game called One Night Stand.
Yeah.
So it's a game where you wake up and you are naked in bed with somebody else, and you're like, well, what is going on? Why am I here? You're totally disoriented. And you have to go through a series of dialogue options in order to figure out what happened, and you're all of a sudden with this woman and you don't know what's going on. And what's interesting about the game is that it encourages you to play it again and again and again so that you get various different options and outcomes of the game.
Yeah.
So like, how is that game different than what we were talking about earlier with the sort of RPG style relationships?
Right. I mean, I feel like it's different in a sense of, well, for one, I don't think there's a kind of win state, like a perfect win state where you, as the player, can like seduce her and like end up in this state where everything is perfectly resolved so that she's like madly in love with you again and wants to like, you know, it's this kind of ambiguous, you're two people who are trying to come to some kind of mutual understanding with each other.
Yeah.
And you can play it as a complete asshole if you want to, but you know, but it also, I think it's interesting to see the different dimensions that come out when you approach that connection in different ways. Like, what if I care more about her feelings about this experience, you know.
Or if you just try to bail and what happens
Yeah.
and the consequences of that, for example.
Yeah.
I think one of the outcomes was like you're basically naked in the street because
Yeah.
she just like kicks you out of your
Yeah.
house.
Yeah.
And she also has personality, like she has a personality and interests and stuff, which I think can be too often female characters in games are just there as like decoration
Right.
or like titillation, and so she has interest. You can't erase the fact that she is a autonomous entity.
Defined
Yeah.
person, right, with
Yeah.
her own personality, her own
Yeah,
interests, exactly.
absolutely.
Yeah.
So the other trend that I noticed this year, well, so we talk a lot about female representations in games, and you know, it's not great, and it's actually not really.
It hasn't really gotten that much better.
You know, one of the things that we do is we collect statistical data at E3, and last year we looked at all of the games that were announced during the press conferences at E3, the major publisher developer press conferences. There were only 2 games out of 59 that had a solo playable female protagonist,
Right.
and those games were announced the year before.
Yeah.
So like it's not really getting better, but
Yeah.
what was interesting is we did see a greater range of representations in terms of men of color,
Yes.
which I think is really great and a huge improvement.
Yeah.
So games like Watch Dogs 2,
Yeah.
Mafia 3, and Battlefield 1 all came out this 2016 and had black men as protagonists.
And not only that, but you know, I think Watch Dogs 2 in particular did some interesting things where it actually tried to acknowledge the existence of structural racism. You know, so it takes place in contemporary San Francisco. Tech culture is a very important aspect of the game, and you know, you have this scene where the protagonist, Marcus Holloway, and a black colleague are going into a major tech company, aware that they're going to be 2 of the only black people in this like overwhelmingly white environment, and they have this like really frank conversation about like the feelings around that, and like the awareness that there are just structural forces at work here that are kind of stacked against us when we go into those, or when we go into that room, like we're expected to represent like all of black culture, or you know, all those kinds of things. So
and too often games when like I think sometimes developers are well-meaning and want to have a greater representation but don't really know how, and so it's almost like you're subbing, like instead of just, you know, you have the grizzled white dude, you just throw in like a grizzled woman or like a grizzled man of color, as opposed to actually like building up that character and really understanding how they exist in this world. And so Watch Dogs 2 does a really interesting job of that, right?
Yeah.
And actually being like, what does it mean to be black in contemporary San Francisco right now?
But you know, with regard to women's representations, I do think, Overwatch, the Blizzard game, which is, hugely popular this year, when they announced their original roster of characters, it was like, oh, all the women fit this same body type, the body type we see in women in games all the time, the kind of slender, long-legged,
big boobs.
And that was kind of disappointing, but to their credit, like in the time since, they've introduced a number of female characters who really break that mold, right? Who are more muscular and you know,
and different classes as well. It's super rare in games to see female characters as a tank class, and they did that, and so it's been. And,
you know, you have like an older woman of color, you know, in the mix now too. I mean, women in games it's not unusual to have male protagonists who are in their 40s, 50s, 60s, but women are usually very young.
Super rare.
So, you know, props to Blizzard for, you know, listening, I think, to feedback and broadening the roster there.
Yeah, totally.
And, you know, speaking of like, of devs listening to feedback, in 2016, Dishonored 2 came out, which I think is a game that, you know, I know you played and loved and made really significant improvements with regard to women over the first game in the series.
So the first Dishonored was terrible to women, like kind of shockingly bad, right? The very first scene, you have a woman in a refrigerator, which is when a woman gets murdered or killed so that a male protagonist can go off and seek revenge or whatever boring story has been done 100 times. And while the game itself is really good, it just continued to do that. So you had like sad weeping women in like French maid outfits, and there was one mission where you actually handed a woman off to a man that she didn't want to be with. Like you knocked her out, and it was not good, right? And so we had been very critical of that, as well as many other folks in the sort of critique, like the cultural feminist critique of games. And when Dishonored 2 was announced, there is now you can play as a female character. Yeah. There's an option. The marketing materials included the female playable character. And in the game itself, while you can choose to play either as the male character or the female character, the world is full of women. So there are female villains, there's female combatants, there's female allies. They're just kind of all over the place, as would happen.
Yeah.
Right?
So what I think is really great about Dishonored 2 in particular is that the changes, they don't feel like kind of these throwaway gimmies to like, oh, let's just throw in a female character. You know, when you play as Emily, you really experience the story in a different way. You get different perspectives on it. So it's very fleshed out. And I think it really shows that, you know, how listening to feedback of this kind can result in a richer, better game experience for everyone.
Absolutely. Yeah, totally.
Wow.
Awesome. Well, thank you for joining us and letting us chat a little bit about things we love. Stay tuned. You can check out our work at feministfrequency.com if you're interested in seeing our videos about games and other pop culture. And stay tuned because there will be tons more stuff on the Engadget stage.